The call came while I was ankle-deep in the Atlantic warm water rolling over sand, the first real silence I'd had in 6 years. My phone vibrated in my hand. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name Colonel Hayes. I answered. "What do you think you're doing, Major?" His voice cut through the wind. "Your leave is cancelled. Get back to Al Udeid immediately. If you're not wheels up in 12 hours, I'll recommend disciplinary action." I actually laughed, not loudly, just one short breath of disbelief. "My leave was approved, sir. I don't care what paperwork you think you have." That's when I hung up. The ocean kept moving. The sky stayed wide. But something inside me shifted, because I knew 2 things at once. First, he was serious. Second, this time, he had just made a mistake he couldn't undo. 6 years in Qatar changes how you experience silence. You stop trusting it. Even now, standing on a quiet stretch of North Carolina coastline, I kept expecting the crackle of a radio or the distant whine of a generator. Instead, I heard gulls, wind, a couple arguing somewhere down the beach, normal life. I hadn't realized how badly I needed that. My leave had been approved 3 weeks earlier, signed digitally, confirmed by squadron admin, logged in the system. I'd checked it 3 separate times before boarding the flight home. After 6 years at Al Udeid Air Base, you learn not to trust anything unless it's documented twice and backed up once. Still, Hayes called anyway. He'd been in command for 8 months, long enough to rearrange schedules, rewrite procedures, and make it clear he believed discipline meant unpredictability. People stopped planning things. Nobody booked leave unless they absolutely had to, and even then they kept their bags half-packed. I didn't. That was probably my first mistake. I walked back to the small rental house I'd borrowed from my sister. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and the screen door snapped shut behind me. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. My duffel bag sat open on the couch, half unpacked, civilian clothes folded neatly beside it. For a moment I just stood there letting the quiet settle. Then I picked up my phone again and opened my email. There it was. Leave approval, Major Laura Bennett authorized 14 days. Command endorsement Colonel Daniel Hayes. Signed, time-stamped, logged. I forwarded the email to myself again just in case. Then I downloaded a copy. Then I took a screenshot. Habit, not paranoia habit. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another buzz, text message. "Call me now, Hayes." I didn't respond. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and poured iced tea into a glass. My hand was steady, but I noticed my pulse in my throat. Not fear, not exactly, just awareness. Because I understood the game he was playing. If I rushed back, he'd win. If I refused, he'd escalate. Either way, he expected me to panic. I didn't. I sat at the small wooden table and opened my notebook, the same one I'd carried for the last year. Inside were scribbled observations, shift changes, reporting habits, who Hayes trusted, who he ignored. I hadn't started it for revenge. I started it because working under him meant constantly adapting. But now it might matter. Hayes liked public pressure. He corrected officers in front of staff. He issued last-minute changes verbally. He relied on people not challenging him. Most did not. Except one. Captain Ramirez. We'd served together briefly in Afghanistan, logistics officer. Quiet, sharp, the kind of man who remembered everything but spoke only when necessary. Hayes disliked him for that reason alone. Ramirez didn't react to intimidation. I hadn't spoken to him in weeks. I considered calling, then decided not to, not yet. Better to wait. My phone buzzed again, voicemail notification. I played it. Major Bennett, this is Colonel Hayes. You are ordered to return immediately. Failure to comply will be documented as refusal of a lawful order. I expect confirmation within the hour. I listened to it twice. He'd said lawful order. That mattered, because if the order contradicted approved leave, it wasn't automatically lawful, and he'd just committed himself on record. I saved the voicemail. Outside, the light shifted toward evening. The ocean turned darker, calmer. I realized something then, not suddenly but quietly. 6 years ago, I would have grabbed my bag and driven to the airport. No questions, no hesitation. Now I didn't move. Instead, I leaned back in the chair and took another sip of tea. Cold, slightly bitter, real. If I returned, I would do it on my terms, with documentation, with witnesses, with the chain of command intact. Because this wasn't about defiance, it was about making him follow the same rules he demanded from everyone else. I closed the notebook and zipped my duffel halfway, not rushing, not stalling, just preparing. The sun slipped below the horizon and the room dimmed. My phone stayed silent. No more messages, no more calls. Somewhere thousands of miles away, Colonel Hayes was waiting for me to fold. I didn't. I finished my tea, turned off the kitchen light, and looked once more at the printed leave approval sitting on the table. This time when I picked up my bag, it wasn't out of pressure. It was because I was ready. And when I stepped outside into the cooling night air, I knew something had already changed. He thought he'd forced me back. He hadn't. He'd just given me the opening I needed. The flight back to Qatar was long enough for doubt to creep in, but not long enough for me to lose focus. The cabin lights dimmed somewhere over the Atlantic, and most passengers settled into restless sleep. I stayed awake, tray table down, notebook open, the printed leave authorization folded neatly beside it like a quiet insurance policy. I replayed Hayes' voicemail again, this time with earbuds in. Failure to comply will be documented as refusal of a lawful order. He'd chosen his words carefully, but he'd also committed himself. If this escalated, that sentence alone would matter, especially if the order wasn't lawful to begin with. I wrote one line beneath it, document everything, no emotion, no improvisation. The flight attendant paused beside me. You military? She asked, glancing at the paperwork. Yeah. Heading back early. I gave a small nod, something like that. She smiled sympathetically. They always pull you back when you finally relax. I almost said yes. Instead, I said nothing, because this time I wasn't being pulled back. I was choosing to return, and that difference mattered. When we landed at Al Udeid Air Base, the heat hit like a wall. Even at night, the air carried that familiar mix of jet fuel dust and distant generators. My boots felt heavier the moment they touched the pavement. 6 years of muscle memory snapped back into place. Posture, pace, awareness. Nothing looked different, but I felt different. I cleared entry, grabbed my duffel, and stepped into the dimly lit corridor leading toward admin. A few night shift airmen glanced up, then did a double take when they recognized me. Ma'am, didn't expect you back yet, one of them said. Plans changed, I replied. That was all, no explanation, just enough. I checked the wall clock. 23:10. Hayes was still on base. He liked late-night control, fewer witnesses, less resistance. If he wanted confrontation, he'd get it tonight. Before heading to operations, I made one stop. Logistics office. The door was half open. Inside, Captain Ramirez sat behind a desk covered in supply manifests. He looked up, surprised, then leaned back slowly. Didn't think you were due back for another week, Bennett. I wasn't. He studied my face. Ramirez didn't ask casual questions. If he spoke, it meant he already sensed something. Hayes, he asked quietly. I nodded. He exhaled once through his nose, figures. I placed the printed leave authorization on his desk. He read it quickly, then flipped to the email header. His eyebrow lifted slightly. He signed this. 3 weeks ago. And now he wants you back. Yes. Ramirez leaned back in his chair. You recording everything? Already started. He gave a small nod of approval. Good. There was a brief silence. The hum of the air conditioner filled it. You know what he's going to do, Ramirez said. He'll frame this as refusal. Say you ignored command urgency. I didn't ignore it. I returned. You returned after hanging up on him. That was true, and dangerous. He left a voicemail, I said. Called it a lawful order. Ramirez's eyes sharpened. That helps. He slid the paper back toward me. You going straight to him? Yes. He considered that, then stood. I'll walk with you. I shook my head. No, not yet. Ramirez understood immediately. Witnesses mattered, but timing mattered more. If this turns into a command issue, he said quietly, I'll be there. I know. He gave a short nod. Good hunting, Major. I picked up the paper and stepped back into the corridor. Operations was 2 buildings over. The walk felt longer than usual. Floodlights cast hard shadows across the concrete. Somewhere in the distance, a transport aircraft spooled up, engines whining. My pulse ticked higher, not panic, just awareness. because once I stepped into that office, everything would shift. Hayes's door was closed, light underneath, voices inside. I knocked. Enter. He looked up immediately. Surprise flashed across his face, then hardened into authority. Major Bennett, finally. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. 2 other officers sat at the table, Sergeant Morales and a junior lieutenant. Both glanced between us. I returned as directed, sir, I said. Hayes leaned back. You took your time. I was on approved leave. His eyes narrowed. Your leave was cancelled. I placed the printed authorization on the desk between us. Signed by you, sir. Morales shifted slightly in his chair. Hayes didn't look down immediately. That told me he remembered signing it. When he finally did, his jaw tightened. That was before operational needs changed. Yes, sir. Do you have the written cancellation? The room went still. The lieutenant looked down at his notes. Morales watched Hayes carefully. Hayes tapped the paper once. I gave you a direct order. Yes, sir. You left a voicemail calling it a lawful order. His head lifted sharply. You recorded it, he asked. I saved it. Silence. Not hostile, not loud, just heavy. Hayes leaned forward slightly. Major, are you questioning my authority? The words hung there. This was the first real test. My heartbeat kicked once hard, but my hands stayed steady at my sides. No, sir, I'm confirming the chain of command documentation. Morales's pen stopped moving. Hayes's expression hardened. He wasn't used to being answered like that, not disrespectful, but not submissive either. You will report at 0600 for reassignment review, he said finally. Yes, sir. I picked up the paper and turned to leave. As I reached the door, I felt it, the shift, small but real. He hadn't dominated the room, he hadn't shut me down. And for the first time, he'd had to think before speaking. That meant the game had started. Sleep came in fragments. Not because I was nervous, but because my mind kept replaying the conversation. Every word, every pause, every shift in tone. By 0540, I was already in uniform boots, laced the morning air, still heavy with desert heat even before sunrise. The operations building was quieter than usual. A few early staffers moved through the hall with coffee cups and tired eyes. When I stepped inside, Sergeant Morales looked up from the duty desk. His expression gave nothing away, but he gave me a small nod. Morning, Major. Morning? He hesitated, then lowered his voice. Colonel's been in since 0500. Of course he had. I signed in, then walked toward the conference room. Through the glass, I saw Hayes already seated at the head of the table. 2 additional chairs were filled. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs from Group Operations and Captain Ramirez's arms folded silent. That was new. Ramirez met my eyes briefly, just a flicker, enough to say, be careful. I entered and took the empty seat halfway down the table. Hayes didn't waste time. Major Bennett returned from leave after being directed to report immediately. He began tone formal. However, the delay raises questions about compliance and respect for command authority. There it was. He was setting the narrative early. I kept my hands still on the table. Briggs glanced toward me. Major, your leave was approved. Yes, sir, signed authorization, no written cancellation. Hayes leaned forward. Operational requirements changed. I issued a direct order. Ramirez shifted slightly but said nothing. Briggs nodded slowly. Was the order documented? Hayes hesitated a fraction of a second. Verbal order, followed by voicemail. I slid the printed approval onto the table, then placed my phone beside it. Sir, may I play the voicemail? Hayes's jaw tightened. That won't be necessary. Briggs looked between us. I think it would help clarify. The room cooled instantly. I tapped the screen. Hayes's voice filled the room. Get back here immediately. Failure to comply will be documented as refusal of a lawful order. Silence followed. The kind that makes everyone aware of breathing. Briggs leaned back slightly. Colonel, was the leave formally revoked? Hayes's fingers drummed once on the table. I exercised command authority. That's not what I asked, Briggs replied evenly. The tension sharpened. This was moving faster than I expected. Hayes shifted tactics. Major Bennett laughed and hung up. That behavior alone raises concerns about professionalism. Every eye turned toward me. This was dangerous ground. Disrespect toward command, even perceived, could trigger an Article 15 review. My pulse jumped once. I kept my voice steady. I acknowledged the order, sir. I returned on the first available flight. Hayes shook his head. You delayed. I was in transit from approved leave. I returned within operationally reasonable time. Morales, standing near the wall, shifted his weight. Ramirez's gaze remained fixed on Hayes. Briggs tapped the table lightly. Timeline. I received the call at 14:30 Eastern Standard Time, I said. Departed within 8 hours. Arrived 23:10 local. Reported immediately. Ramirez spoke for the first time. That's consistent with available flights. Hayes shot him a look. Captain, I don't recall asking for input. Ramirez didn't react. You didn't, sir. But the damage was done. Another voice in the room. Another witness. Hayes leaned forward, voice rising slightly. Major, are you questioning my leadership in front of my staff? The words landed heavy. Morales froze. The lieutenant outside the door glanced in. The air felt thick. One wrong sentence, and this could turn into undermining command authority. My heartbeat thudded hard enough I felt it in my throat. I kept my hands flat on the table so no one would see the tension. No, sir, I said quietly. I'm clarifying documentation to ensure compliance with chain of command. No challenge, no apology, just fact. Briggs nodded slowly. Hayes tried again. Your tone during the call? With respect, Sir Briggs interrupted. The issue is whether the order superseded approved leave. That stopped him. Hayes leaned back, recalculating. I could almost see it the moment he realized the room wasn't entirely his anymore. Ramirez slid a document forward. Sir, leave cancellation requires admin entry. There's no OPREP update reflecting Bennett's recall. Hayes stared at him. Captain. I checked this morning, Ramirez added calmly. Silence again. Hayes's authority hadn't collapsed, but it had cracked. Briggs exhaled quietly. Colonel, I recommend we treat this as procedural clarification, not disciplinary. That was the turning point. Not victory, not yet, but the edge shifted. Hayes's expression hardened. He nodded once. Very well, Major Bennett will resume duty pending further review. Yes, sir. The meeting ended without another word. As chairs scraped back, Morales passed behind me and murmured quietly, that was close. He wasn't wrong. I stepped into the hallway. My hands finally relaxed. My pulse slowed gradually. Behind me, Hayes remained seated. I could feel his stare even without turning. The first real clash had happened. And neither of us had backed down. The second meeting came faster than I expected. At 1400, Morales stopped me outside operations. Colonel wants everyone in Conference Room B group-level review. His tone was neutral, but the slight tightening around his eyes said everything. This wasn't routine. When I walked in, the room was already full. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs sat near the middle this time, not at the head. Hayes stood instead of sitting, hands braced lightly on the table. Captain Ramirez leaned against the wall, arms crossed. 2 additional officers I hadn't seen earlier were present, legal liaison and admin. That changed the stakes immediately. Hayes didn't wait. This meeting concerns breakdown in command responsiveness. He began voice-controlled but louder than necessary. When an officer delays compliance, operational risk increases. That cannot happen. He wasn't naming me yet, but he didn't need to. My pulse picked up slightly. I stayed still. He tapped a folder. Major Bennett returned late after a direct recall. That delay required reassignment adjustments. There it was, he was reframing the narrative again. Not about legality, about operational impact. Briggs watched carefully. Ramirez didn't move. Hayes turned toward me. Major, explain why you did not immediately comply. Every eye landed on me. Even Morales, standing by the door, looked tense. I returned on the first available flight, sir. You hung up on me? Yes, sir. The room tightened. That admission mattered. Hayes stepped closer. That behavior suggests disregard for command authority. This was the trap. Push me into defensiveness. Make it emotional. Instead, I slid a printed timeline across the table. Call received 14:30. Flight booked 15:20. Departure 22:30. Arrival 23:10 local. Reported immediately. The legal officer picked up the sheet. Hayes's jaw flexed. You still delayed. Travel time, sir. He leaned forward, voice sharper. Major, Are you telling this room you determine when to obey orders? The temperature in the room seemed to drop. This was the moment Ramirez had warned about. One wrong tone, insubordination. My heart thudded once hard. I forced my breathing slow. No, sir, I complied within logistical limits. Hayes's hand struck the table, not loud but enough. That is not immediate compliance. Silence. Briggs leaned forward slightly. Colonel, was leave formally revoked? Hayes didn't answer right away. That pause said everything. Instead, he pivoted. Even if leave existed, operational need supersedes. The legal officer cleared his throat. Only with documented recall authority, sir. Another crack. Hayes's eyes flicked toward him, then back to me. He shifted tactics again. Major Bennett's tone during the call was dismissive. That undermines discipline. This was the most dangerous angle yet. Tone is subjective, hard to defend. I spoke carefully. I acknowledge the order, sir. You laughed. Yes, sir. Morales shifted again behind me. Ramirez's gaze stayed fixed on Hayes. Hayes seized it. That is not professional conduct. I didn't argue, didn't explain, just nodded once. Yes, sir. That disarmed him slightly. No resistance, no escalation. He pressed forward anyway. I am recommending formal counseling. That wasn't catastrophic, but it would stain my record. Ramirez pushed off the wall. Sir, may I clarify one point? Hayes stiffened. Make it quick. Ramirez stepped forward. Major Bennett arrived and reported the same night. No mission delay occurred. Logistics absorbed shift coverage. He placed a document down. After action report. The legal officer read it. Briggs leaned closer. Hayes's expression hardened. He hadn't expected Ramirez to prepare that. This doesn't address compliance, Hayes said. Ramirez didn't blink. It addresses operational impact. That mattered. Hayes's argument depended on claiming harm. The legal officer nodded slightly. No operational degradation noted. Another shift. Hayes realized it. His voice rose slightly. Major, are you questioning my leadership in front of my staff? The words hit harder this time. My pulse spiked. The room went still. Even the air conditioner sounded louder. This was the cliff edge. I felt the weight of it, career, reputation, everything balanced on the next sentence. My hand stayed flat on the table. No, sir, I'm documenting compliance. Quiet, controlled, no emotion. Briggs exhaled slowly. The legal officer glanced at Hayes. Hayes's shoulders tightened. For a moment he looked like he might escalate further. Then he stopped. He leaned back, folding his arms. Very well, he said. We'll review procedures. It wasn't defeat, but it wasn't control either. The meeting ended shortly after. Chairs scraped, papers gathered. As people filed out, Morales passed me again. You almost got boxed in. I know. Ramirez caught up with me in the hallway. You held the line, he said quietly. He pushed hard. He needed you to react. I nodded. Down the corridor, Hayes stepped out of the room. He didn't look at me, but I felt it, the tension still there, unresolved. This wasn't over. But the balance had changed. And this time everyone had seen it. By the time the sun dropped behind the low buildings of Al Udeid, the base had settled into its familiar evening rhythm engines, humming in the distance, radios murmuring the dry desert air, cooling just enough to breathe. But something had shifted. People didn't say it openly, yet I felt it in small things. Conversations paused when I walked in, Morales greeting me with a firmer nod, Ramirez lingering near operations instead of disappearing back to logistics. The ripple had begun. I sat alone in my quarters, boots off, sleeves rolled, reviewing the documents one last time. The leave approval, the voicemail transcript, the timeline, Ramirez's after-action report. Each piece by itself was small. Together they formed something stronger, a record, a quiet, structured narrative that didn't rely on emotion, just facts. My phone buzzed, unknown extension. Major Bennett. It was Lieutenant Colonel Briggs. Major, I've reviewed the documentation, he said. There will be no disciplinary action. Your recall was procedurally unclear. You'll resume normal duties. A slow breath left my chest. Not relief, something steadier. Yes, sir. He paused. And Major, you handled that professionally. The line clicked off. I sat there for a moment staring at the wall. 6 years earlier, I wouldn't have fought this. I would have absorbed it, adjusted, moved on. That's how survival worked in places like this. Keep your head down, don't challenge command, wait it out. But something about this time felt different. A knock at my door. Ramirez leaned in, heard, "Yes." He nodded once, good. We stood in silence for a second. Then he added quietly, "He'll be more careful now." I know. That's the real win. He left without another word. Later that night I walked across the base. The floodlights cast long shadows across the concrete. Somewhere a transport plane taxied slowly, its engines low and steady. The air smelled faintly of dust and fuel, familiar grounding. Morales caught up with me near operations. He said people noticed. Noticed what? That someone pushed back, without blowing things up. I gave a small shrug, just followed the paperwork. He smiled slightly, still. He continued on, leaving me alone again. I stopped near the edge of the flight line. The desert stretched dark beyond the lights. 6 years ago, this place felt like something to endure. Now it felt different. Not because Hayes had changed, not because the system was kinder. Because I had. I thought back to that moment on the beach, the phone in my hand, his voice cutting through the wind. 6 years of pressure behind me, one decision in front of me. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't argued, I hadn't tried to win loudly. I just refused to move without documentation. And that had changed everything. Behind me, the base continued its quiet rhythm. People working, planes moving, the chain of command still intact, nothing dramatic, nothing broken. But the way authority moved through the system, that felt different now. 6 years ago, I was just a major trying to survive each deployment, each shift, each unpredictable decision. Today, I wasn't just surviving. I had forced the system to acknowledge its own rules without stepping outside them. That was the kind of revenge that lasted. Not humiliation, not confrontation, just accountability. I looked out into the darkness one more time, then turned back toward the lights of the base. Tomorrow would be routine again, briefings, reports, operations. Hayes would still be in command. The hierarchy would still exist. But now everyone knew something they hadn't known before. Authority wasn't absolute. Documentation mattered. And quiet resistance done correctly could reshape the balance. If you've ever served under someone who mistook authority for control, you probably know this feeling. Not the thrill of beating them, but the calm of knowing the rules protected you if you were patient enough to use them. I'd like to know where you're listening from. Have you ever faced a moment like this where staying calm mattered more than fighting back? Share your thoughts below. And if stories like this resonate with you, stay with us. There are more journeys ahead. Quiet ones, difficult ones, and sometimes ones that change everything in ways no one expects. Because sometimes the strongest move is simply refusing to step outside the rules and letting the system correct itself.